Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Josh Wonders Why. I'm joined tonight not by Pastor Kelly. You may notice we've duplicated people, but it's not neither of them are Pastor Kelly. Tonight we'll be talking about the recent UMC General Conference that just occurred down at Charlotte, North Carolina for the past 2 weeks. I guess not this week, but the past 2 weeks. So I asked both MaryKate Annin and Janée LaFuze, who are both Indiana delegates, to come and just give us a overview of the General Conference. I'll have some questions. If you have some questions too, we'd love to hear your questions. So put anything in the comments if you have any questions, because I think what you may have heard in the mainstream news and media is probably different than what actually went on there. Mm-hmm. So if you do have any questions, if maybe your friends or family members are asking questions about what they heard, just type them in the comments. We'd love to answer any questions, comments, or anything you have. So I guess before we get into some of the main questions, for those of us who are on the edge or maybe not fully in the know about General Conference, could you give us an overview for what General Conference is?
Yeah, so in essence, what General Conference is it's one of the legislative bodies, basically, of the United Methodist Church. The Methodist Church is worldwide, and so that means that it has organizational structure. So one of those pieces is the General Conference. Similar to the United States government, the United Methodist Church is divided into three parts. The executive branch is the Council of Bishops. The judicial branch is called the Judicial Council, which is a body elected out of the General Conference. And then the General Conference itself is like Congress, so it's the legislative body. Us, as delegates, are like the congressmen and women who are then elected to go for that one conference time, and we basically make legislation in relation to the United Methodist Church on how it works, the legal binding aspects, as well as some of the spiritual formation things, such as where do we stand on certain world issues, for example, and how is that directed. Or we have a thing called the social principles, which is one thing we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's kind of like our guiding ideas of how we are to be Methodists in the world. And so it's a really big event. Takes place over 10 to 12 days every 4 years. But this conference was actually a postponed 2020 conference because there was a little thing called COVID, which delayed the original one. And so basically this is a postponed conference and the 2024 conference. So since it only happens every 4 years, this would have been a normal 4-year cycle, but it kind of took the place for two conferences.
So it's been about 8 years since the previous one, right?
Yeah,
and 2016 was
exactly.
the last time.
Someone asked about why make up the 2020? Mm-hmm. Why not just do the 2024? And kind of the long and short of it is there was a whole lot of legislation that was put forth starting in 2016 to 2020 and that quadrennium that had to be dealt with. You can't just put it to the side. So it kind of all dates back to that 2016 stopping point from the last time.
Yeah. Sure. And it's not, like you said, it's not just the United States, it's the worldwide Methodist Church comes together.
Right. And if you're curious, that's on 5 different continents right now.
Okay.
And so you're talking Europe, Africa, Asia, North America, South America, Australia, ? I don't know if there's a Methodist church in Australia. I don't think they were represented. I don't think we had any because of just how the faith works out there. But that's a lot of people. We had, I believe there was slated to be 872 something delegates. So that's a lot of people to sit down and make decisions on legislation.
Yes.
And was not something that everyone is necessarily tuning into.
Hey, we're sort of doing a live stream right now, Claire.
So this is what happens when we've got both parents in one place. Is one kid may come and join us on and off. So you've tuned in before. You've seen that. When you see me on, there's a risk of my children coming in.
So that's a good overview. I guess going into this General Conference, how long have you both been prepping for it? I guess there's been some training you've been going through, right?
Yes. So
how long has that been going on?
Well, for us, it's only been since last summer.
Okay.
When really a lot of the training, a lot of our meetings really didn't start until the fall of 2023. We were elected in at last year's annual conference. the Indiana Annual Conference, right? But the others, most of our delegation were elected back in after the 2019 special called General Conference, and are on year 5 of this, right?
Or more,
so some have been doing it for 5 years. We
Okay.
have only been on since last summer.
Okay, but it's been a long time coming. I mean, almost about a year prepping for this, right?
We've spent plenty of times, plenty of Saturdays, at least once a month, getting together and kind of talking about things and just preparing for it. So yeah.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, I wanted to discuss. There are, I don't know, how many pieces of legislation were there that you went through?
1,099 pieces of legislation
get to 1,100?
were submitted.
Oh, submitted. Okay.
So
submitted and approved to be dealt
Okay.
with.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a whole process for this. So a really unique thing about the Methodist Church is that any one person can make a difference in the United Methodist Church. There is no special requirement to be someone who submits legislation for the General Conference. It can be any individual. So you sitting at your home, if you're a United Methodist, congratulations, you are qualified to write a piece of legislation for
And some people take that
very seriously.
Write hundreds of pieces of legislation.
But most people write it with groups, or they're part of official groups within the church. But I would say, I don't know how many we passed, but quite a couple hundred at least minimum, that will actually talk about in-depth pass on the floor. There's a whole process to how that even gets there, but in short, of the 1,000 plus we'll deal with, a lot of them will get filtered out in what we call committee. So that first week, we spend in smaller groups and filter through some of that, because sometimes there'll be for example, there was one piece of legislation where it had 15 to 20 other pieces that are almost identical to some degree, or they're trying to talk about one topic. So we'll narrow it down to 1 or 2, and then those will actually hit the floor. And based on how it's voted in committee, it'll either pass or fail on the floor, or it'll be debated. And so there's a whole process for that. And if anyone here is a parliamentarian and really loves Robert's Rules of Order, you will love the General Conference.
Yes, you would. And should we say there is a method?
There is a method to the madness.
There's a reason that this is called Methodism.
Yeah.
Methodism.
Yeah.
Very good. If you're just joining us, Josh Wonders Why special night with Kelly being on vacation, I've asked Janée, LaFuze, and MaryKate Annin, both Indiana delegates for the General Conference for UMC, to come and just give their experiences. So if you have any questions, put them in the comments and we can get to them. So going to the General Conference, I think there were 4 main legislation, what was this the right word? Anyways, 4 main, or not 3, sorry, I'm already messing up the question. There were 3 main areas of legislation that were tabled from 2020 that were probably at the forefront of the whole conference, right? And they call the 3 R's. There's regionalization, removing harmful language, and revive social principles. I was wondering if we could just give a brief overview for what each of those 3 R's are.
Sure, that'd be
in
fine.
Whatever order you want to go in.
Well, I'll start with the regionalization. That's probably got a lot of discussion at the forefront. So the way I see it now, I work in a school, and that's what my degree is in. So I think of our churches as like the schools, right? And they're kind of built that way. So our schools are part of a school district, and those districts are part of conferences, and those conferences are part of the state, right? And they just keep building bigger till we have the National Education Association. Churches are the same way, right? Our local churches are part of a district. Mm-hmm. Those districts are part of conferences. Okay, and here in the United States, the next step up in that kind of neighborhood is jurisdictions, and those are just regions. And we have 5 of them here in the United States. So if you've ever sat in a social studies class in elementary school, you probably learned about the 5 regions of the U.S., and we're all a part of that. Outside of the U.S., we have something called central conferences. That would be the other places that Janée was talking about. South America, some from South America, the Philippines particularly. Well, I guess that's Africa, Europe, and Asia. Mm-hmm. Africa and the Philippines is what I was trying to get to before, probably have the largest presence outside of the United States. And so these central conferences have the ability to kind of tailor parts of our book of discipline, our rule book, to their context, their culture, how they live, and what church looks like in their areas of the world. We in the United States don't have that. And so essentially what that's doing is giving the United States its own region, just like the Central Conference is. Then the Central Conferences will just be renamed the regions. And it just gives us, again, the ability to contextualize our ministry. It also kind of alleviates the need for those outside of the U.S. to have to deal with things that are U.S.-centric. So if they don't want to have to spend their time, their dollars, all that kind of stuff, sitting through legislation like this that we can deal with in the U.S., because it only affects the U.S., it's probably one of the big reasons that they're supportive of it. There's a lot, and I started with this because there's a lot of talk about how some of these central conferences don't want regionalization. They think it's just the U.S. trying to take a power grab. And if you're hearing that, I would probably ask you to maybe sift through that a little bit more, look some other places, because it was actually very, very highly supported. One part of it, the actual approval of it, needed 2/3 vote in approval. And then now that happened, and that passed with 90% approval. So if we're talking about these central conferences, while they do make up less delegates than the United States is not 90%. So in order to get to these 90, 92, 93% approval ratings that we were getting throughout General Conference, that was a global vote. That was not a U.S.-centric vote. So anyways, that's all that does, is we just can contextualize our ministry to the part of the world that we live in.
The other thing you mentioned, I think before, and maybe I'm going to get this wrong because I'm not an expert of this like you both are, but isn't there also that allows other regions outside the U.S. that may be more hardly regulated by their governments? They're not, they don't have to, I guess, follow the same sort of interpretation or whatever we want to do for how we handle in the U.S.
Right, and that's part of that. That's part of their contextualization, which they actually already have. The U.S. is the only one place that doesn't have that, so that's just kind of broadening what that was already there. We're just kind of drawing the circle a little wider now.
What percent of the delegates were? You said it wasn't 90%. What percent were made up of the U.S.?
Well, I saw those numbers.
Somewhere around 50 to 60%. Does that sound about right?
Yeah,
60, 70 maybe. I'll have to look again.
I think it was 60 some odd percent is the U.S. right?
Alone. The next biggest is Africa, and then after Africa, I believe it's going to be Philippines and Europe.
I would probably say the Philippines.
Technically, there is no central conference in Latin America, I don't believe. They have a different type of relationship with the Methodist Church as a whole. Right. And so it's a little different. But I think that leads to a really good point, which is the second thing. So part of that needing of contextualization led to the removal of what we call prohibitive or harmful, depending on who you talk to, language, which basically related to persons of the LGBTQ community who, while can be allowed to be full members of the church, are still or were prohibited from being able to be ordained, were prohibited from being married in the church or having a UMC pastor marry them. And any pastor who did such or allowed such to happen in their church could have what we call charges brought against them. So we do have a judicial council which handles things like that. And so, for example, if a pastor were to have married a gay couple, they could have faced charges from the church. Now, those wouldn't be like getting sued per se, but for example, they could lose their ordination. And so they could have certain restrictions or punishments put upon them for it. Now, I want to preface this with some people and in some places had been openly just ignoring those restrictive languages for some time. And we have known that, and that has caused what the 2019 special session was all about, was about this conversation about how do we be in ministry with and community with persons of the LGBTQ community when the United Methodist Church as a worldwide denomination is drastically different in theology on that topic. Okay. And so the removal of the language wasn't to necessarily add affirmative language. The goal was neutral, because in certain places like some countries in Africa, not all, but some, if the church were seen to have added protective language, like saying person should be regardless of sexual orientation, the government could come for Methodists in that country and kill them. Like that is a reality that they must face that is different than here in the United States, where that would be seen as a hate crime. And there are punishments and protections for that. That is not true everywhere. Right. And so part of our being delegates is navigating how do you create a discipline or a guidebook for the Methodist Church that allows for the difference of culture, which led to it is one of the reasons why regionalization was so popular at the General Conference, because it allows for some of that.
Right.
But one of the joys that I think MaryKate and I can share about, for us, was seeing it prohibited. I have friends who are, queer, and I have a friend specifically who's in seminary right now, and the privilege to be able to call them and tell them that they don't have to switch denominations, but can become a pastor in ours, is a beautiful thing.
Without breaking the rules, because there are some that willingly put themselves out there, and there were some, they would open themselves up to charges being brought, but there were also places that kind of had this, I wouldn't want to call it an unspoken thing, but a good faith of you don't have to bring charges, right? Charges would have to be brought, and you could choose not to, and that it just happened as the world progresses. We always hear about that throughout history, civil disobedience, and just kind of this idea of we have to kind of push boundaries and risk getting in trouble if we believe in what we're working for. If we want to kind of push those boundaries. So that was kind of the removal, the second R, removal of harmful or restrictive language.
Let's talk about, I guess real quick, I have a follow-up question for that one. So that in itself is pretty historical and pretty monumental.
It is.
Extremely.
Were you both in the room when it passed, like in the...
Were we...
I was.
Were you in the bar? It's called the bar, right?
Yes, so the bar is where you get to vote for. I did get to take one.
You did.
I did. The removal of the ban on gay clergy, I did get to press the yes button to have that removed, and I know that there's going to be people who agree and disagree with that, but it was a really, really, for me personally, a proud moment that I got to do that. And it was a really respectful moment, though, because what I know from the 2019 and even all the previous ones, votes that went out that were highly impactful were not always handled graciously.
Right.
And I say that as much for the quote-unquote winners as the losers, right? I mean, you know what I mean by that. And this time, it was very respectful on both sides, I kind of thought. So that was a really monumental. There was tears, there were hugging, there was singing at the appropriate time, not during plenary session. But there was a lot more that was removed than just those things. They also defined what marriage was, which was actually brought in when we're talking about the global aspect. That was actually a global delegate, an outside the U.S. delegate, who kind of, rather than amending it to change it in ways that could have been debated, brought a unifying definition rather than it just being one between a man and a woman, which is what it had always been. And that's not what was brought forward in this proposal. And they found this kind of unique way to kind of accommodate, I don't know if that'd be the right word, but to understand that this is a global place. And it didn't bring any arguing, really. It really was something that, once we could get the language barrier taken care of, brought a lot of unity. People were happy about it on all sides.
Yeah.
So then what's then the third one, let's get on that, the revised social principles.
Yes, so Janée was kind of talking about that earlier, that we have a guide on kind of social living, I guess you could call it. They're not the rules per se, but they are guidelines for how church should be out in society. You said it a way earlier that I liked, but I can't remember the words now. But it's very legislative heavy, and I'm talking about U.S. government like they are on Capitol Hill, they are right there in Washington, D.C. But I don't say that, and I always want to say this, they don't say that as we the church want to tell the government how to rule, as in the church. What am I thinking of? You guys, I'm real tired. Sorry. Like church and state. They keep church and state separate as far as that goes, but what it is what is our responsibility, our Jesus responsibility out in the social context in the world? And we know our policies affect how people live in the world. And so they kind of take those things on. I'm not even going to be able to get into all the different ways, but guns, gun violence, wars, abortion, human sexuality, marriage, divorce, alcohol, gambling. Just the list is just so long.
A lot of them.
Any aspect that you could think of that would affect people in society, they have something about it. Healthcare, all of it, immigration, it's all there, poverty. And so it's long. They revised it starting back in 2012. They started talking to a couple thousand people around the world and really digging into what do you see, what is your feedback on the social principles. And they also combined some things. I wanted to cut it down to make it more concise and kind of more in a layman's terms. And so they revised those, and they've literally spent the last 12 years revising those and really put it into context globally. And so that also removed some of that language that we just got done talking about to make it neutral, and they were just revised. And so now we've just got a more clear, concise way of living in our current world so that it is applicable to current and modern times.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you running through that, because that really helps us understand what the main pieces of legislation. I know there are other pieces, and I may ask you about that in a little bit, but those are the main ones, the main focus. And you touched on this a little bit, but some of those pieces of legislation, people could consider maybe controversial in a way or whatnot. So what were your thoughts preparing and going into the General Conference of what you thought you were going to experience versus what you actually experienced, right? Were you going there ready for a fight and debate, or, what were your thoughts going in there? Yeah.
Yes. For me, yes. I had watched the 2019 General Conference, which was just on one topic. And to see the divisiveness of the church, where there was fighting and yelling, and you could see just some of the vitriol from people towards other people, and as well as I knew many of my close friends and family were very hurt. People I love very dearly were hurt by the outcome of the 2019 General Conference. And due to that, I was very nervous coming into this one. I did not know what to expect. So as a first-time delegate, you hear stories, and most of my stories were negative that I had heard from past attendees, and especially since everything had kind of blown up since 2016, and things kept getting more and more divisive. I got more, "You're crazy," or "Wow, you're really brave," which gives you a lot of confidence going into a general conference, right? But I was pleasantly surprised to find that those who came to this general conference wanted to be United Methodist. Like, we all shared that in common. We believe solely in our identity as Methodists, United Methodists specifically. And so I felt like a lot of the people I worked with, our goal wasn't trying to be right, it was trying to be unified. And that's a different goal than what I think I had assumed would be the goal. I was ready to kind of put my hands up a little bit if I had to, only for the protection of the people I have to be in ministry with. That's just a reality. Like, I have to try to make the church someplace that they can belong, and it's hard for me to do that. Based on the experiences and stories I have heard coming out of spaces like this. But I was so pleased to come and say that I think my experience overall was positive. I mean, it's long days. It's a lot of head work. It's exhausting work, yeah. But, in the end, I enjoyed it. I had a blast. I found myself feeling privileged to be there, to be thought of being someone of, merit in the conference, that they would say, "Hey, we believe in you to be in this space and be someone we can trust in this space." And I felt like, for me, it was an overall positive experience. I'm not going to say there wasn't times that it got a little hairy, because we still differ in opinion, and we
Yeah.
still are not the same.
Right.
We're not all, the same exact person. So there's still moments where tensions are high, but I never felt like it was like
Harmful.
Yes, thank you.
It
I
was
trying to
not.
think of
It was
not
not
harmful.
No one was harmful to anybody else. Mostly.
Yeah.
There were moments that it did happen, but it was so minimal that a lot of that outweighed. And I think I agree with everything she said. There's lots of stories. There's lots of, you have to be prepared for the worst.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think we did to prepare specifically for the Indiana delegation was there was a real sense from many in our delegation to learn I don't want to say both sides, but more than one viewpoint, right? Everybody comes in and wants to be on this delegation because they have beliefs that sit a certain way and they want to see those move forward in our church. But there was also this real sense of, okay, I know my viewpoint on these pieces of legislation. What are the other sides? What are the other perspectives? And so there were times where we actively sought out, quote unquote, the other side, right? Other perspectives on some of these legislation. If we were for it, who was against it? If we were against it, who was for it? I can't say that we all came out to think that way. The purpose wasn't to say, well, change my mind. It was just, we want to understand what is going to happen when it comes in. And I think that was part of our preparation. It was legitimate. It was not, oh, let's listen so that we can then just argue their point. It was, what is going to come up? What is going to be said? What are the arguments for or against these things? And really, if it was going to get contentious, you got to prepare for something like that. So there really was this, it wasn't even defensive. It was legitimately wanting to prepare. And I thought that was kind of interesting, that so many of us wanted to just understand it more fully as we went in.
Okay. That's good to hear. One more question on the legislation. I'll get to some other maybe non-legislative topics, give you a break. But so we talked about the main legislation. I'm curious, was there like a more obscure, like minor legislation that passed that really you were excited about?
I have one. So
Hey, Janée.
There we go. To give you time to think about
Yeah.
your
I
legislation.
already know.
So this is a monumental general conference. So I am currently pursuing to be ordained as a deacon. And as of this last general conference, deacons now have sacramental rights. So historically, deacons and elders are what we call separate kind of calls within clergy. So they're both clergy, but it's a different way of expressing your call. And deacons are called to specific people at specific times in specific places, or they're called to, or another way of thinking of it is they're like the bridge between the world and the church. And then those are called deacons. Elders, on the other hand, are viewed as like the administrators. That's often the one they have. And sacraments was seen as another one. But the church, as it's kind of developed, has found that deacons often find themselves in spaces where they need to provide sacrament for persons who are outside the local church. And not every place has easy access to an elder who can do it through the normal means. And so where it is applicable in their ministry setting, they're automatically given basically sacramental right, which I think is a really cool thing. I personally think that is a good way forward for pastors to be more present in spaces where people can experience communion and baptism, which in Wesley theology, we believe are conversion abilities, where we have the ability to experience God. And we say they're God's, they're God's table. It's God's baptism. It's not ours. We're not the ones saving ourselves, And so it's just a cool little thing that I think will be really creative here in the next few years as we see more deacons being able to be in that space. And I heard a lot of stories from deacons there at General Conference who were very for it. I also do know, though, those deacons who maybe aren't for it, and I respect their different opinions. That was part of my learning process. I appreciate a good friend kind of explained, well, if you feel called to the sacraments, that's why we have elders. And not all elders are, truthfully, in the local church. And so it was a fair conversation. It's a good thing. So that for me was one of the big ones that happened that I was really excited about.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, one that I actually didn't hear much about, because it wasn't in the legislative group I was in, and it all passed through what we call consent calendar. So when we're in those small groups, those committees, if it's passed out of that committee with 10 or less no votes, so it was highly favored, right? It can go on what's called a consent calendar. Basically, it can be bundled and passed through as a bundle. And all the people voting get to see what that is, but it's just not discussed in the large group plenary session. And so there were quite a number of pieces, or a handful of pieces that were, so with the conference, although I'm scaling back on that, am part of or lead a committee on disability advocacy and LGBTQ queer inclusion, but we also have, it's called Diversity, Missions, and Justice, and it also takes on a lot of anti-racism work. And so there was a lot of racial equity petitions and ones for disability advocate, for clergy who have disabilities. Their ordination process and accommodations that can come through, and just processes for those with disabilities, and including and expanding accessibility beyond architectural structures of buildings, physical stuff, to include beyond just what you can see, right? So communication issues, neurodivergencies, sensory things like that. So we just kind of also expanded who we're allowing in that circle and how easily we're letting them in. One on my committee who does a lot of work, she was the one that I kind of turn to for things that I don't know, and she's very excited by these things. And I don't think she's always easily excited by a lot of. She can be skeptical because of her past with that. And she was really excited by some of these things. But also there were 2 apologies that were passed through. One of them was to survivors and victims of sexual misconduct in the United Methodist Church, and that was actually read there on the spot, and there are additional steps that are in place to be taken. And then the other one, which wasn't done there and was kind of amended down, I'd like to see that expand personally, but is an apology to the Hawaiian Kingdom for the overthrow of their monarchy back in the late 1800s, Queen Liliuokalani, and the illegal annexation, which I've been on this before talking about Hawaii a little bit, but there is an apology that passed through. It should hopefully then open up the door to actually taking actionable steps. So those are the ones that came to my mind.
Interesting. Okay. So we talked all about this legislation. I think, but I understand there was more than just discussing laws or legislation. There were worship services. And I guess, can you give us a flavor for those worship services? I feel, were they led by various people of international, like African people and European? So it wasn't all just a U.S.-based worship, and were there sermon songs? What did they? Was it multicultural experience?
It had its moments of multicultural.
It did. Yeah. I would say there was one day they brought in the Congolese choir, so the delegation from Congo, they came up basically and sang. That was my personal favorite day.
Awesome. That was really
There's nothing like a Congolese worship service to get you in the mood to dance. They just put it that way. And it threw me back to when I had visited there in 2016. And I loved that day. That was amazing. The band was very talented. They could do a lot of different genres and a different style. They definitely were gospel inspired. So we had a lot of good gospel flavor. And the bishops are the one we get to hear preach. So that's always fun.
Bishops are the ones that preach. Okay,
so we get to hear from bishops. And we currently have 47. I don't remember how many worldwide bishops we have, but we have somewhere in that range. And we got to hear from a different one every day. So the first order of business every day is worship. So before we do anything, we pray, we sing, we praise God. And that is every day. It does not matter what we're doing that day, we worship first. And then after that, we do our business. And so I think for me, there were some really impassioned preachers who had some great guiding principles. I loved the first Native American bishop. Actually, it was a historic moment in the church. We've recently elected a Native American bishop, the first one ever, and he presided one day. but he also preached another day. And one of his guiding principles to us, the delegates, one of his kind of moments he wanted to inspire us was by saying, what you do today, make a decision that will impact the next 7 generations, not just the one you're in. Make decisions that will help people in the future who aren't here yet, who aren't part of the church, or who will be part of the church one day in this capacity. And I thought that was really inspiring. And so there's some really cool stuff like that happens every single day.
That sounds like cool.
So, there was a different flair for music regularly. Different people leading worship, even just reading Bible verses or leading prayers. Sometimes those were in another language, and we could put on headphones. So everything was most things were in English, and even those non-native English speakers preached in English and did most of their work in English. But there was a whole set of booths, and in that room, in any room we were in, that were translating into multiple different languages, and you could put on your headphones to listen to that. So there were some that would pray in another language or read a Bible verse in another language, and we could put on our headphones. I enjoyed listening to some of that in somebody else's native language. Or they'd bring pieces of their culture to them, like you were talking about this bishop who's a native indigenous, brought in pieces of culture to kind of, he just brought his authentic self, I guess, just to really bring his authenticity.
He made authenticity. He did. He brought, so every bishop kind of has like this shepherd's hook, and his had special carvings and beading on it to represent the culture he comes from.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of unique. And some of the African bishops also I've seen before have similar things. And so it's this really beautiful homage to their tradition and their understanding of faith that may be different than the mainstream way of practicing it here in the United States.
Which is pretty cool.
It's pretty cool.
Did you have any downtime when you were there? It sounds like you just jam-packed.
You mean, did we go swimming? We did not.
I know. That was my question is, did you have any downtime? And what did you do to decompress, I guess?
After 6:30 at night, we would really be going from 8 in the morning till 6:30 at night. Yes. Janée had one day where it was, 9:30. There was a hard stop. So you had to stop by 6:30 every day, but there were 2 days, the last day of committee work and then the last day where you could actually go into, the last day we didn't. We had to stop at 6:30. They kicked us out. Yep. But there was one day where you could actually stay as late as 9:30 to finish that up.
And conference committee, the latest committee to finish, which was the one I was on, finished at 9:28.
Yes. And so there were other days where we had it, if we wanted to extend beyond 6:30, which is a relatively new thing, right? I think in the past you could go as late as you needed to, and that could be taken advantage of, and people really weren't taking self-care. And so they were really trying to focus on more self-care. And so they put a 6:30 stop, and then you'd have to kind of break the rules and vote. You could vote to extend the time, which everything had to have a vote. Everything had to be approved. Everything had to have a vote. You had to vote on the ability to vote sometimes. It really got kind of tedious sometimes. But yeah, in the evenings, you could eat there if you were a delegate. I was a reserve delegate, so I technically wasn't fed. I had to go find my own nourishment. But we as a delegation, many of us went out almost every single night afterwards for a dinner. Okay. And we really had a lot. I think that saved me. Yeah. It was just this relationship building with our delegation, or parts of our delegation. We just would go and we would have fun and we would relax. And they did host Archives hosted a Methodist trivia night, of which I did not participate.
And I would have never, even as a seminarian, gotten this because they were wanting dates for stuff, and I was like,
It was hardcore metho nerd trivia, which I didn't stay, but we went there for dinner and sat outside the trivia area. So there were some things planned.
Yes, I can make a recommendation. If you're ever in Charlotte, North Carolina, I highly recommend the Public House, which is downtown Charlotte. It is fantastic. It was good. We has like bomb mac and cheese with bacon. It was 10 out of 10.
So we made sure that we had some fun. I think for me that was the self-care, was just this relationship building and creation of new friends. We had a little chat going, and even if it pops up now, it still brings up I get excited, right? Because, oh my gosh, what are they going to say? I miss talking with them all the time. And that shows just the relationship that we were able to build with each other.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So, I'm trying to think which question I want to ask next. So I guess if you could think about your entire experience, the 10, 12 days you're there, what was your favorite experience, the high point, like the thing that you'll remember? for a long time?
Mine's easy.
Mac and cheese. Oh.
With bacon.
Okay, the mac and cheese lives right free in my head. I do not lie. But no. So we talked about the removal of the restrictive language. The big one that has always been the most contentious has been barring, the language used to say, self-avowed practicing homosexuals. That was the term that was put in there. So if you were in any committed relationship as a gay person to a person of the same sex, you would not be permitted to be ordained, technically, based on the Book of Discipline. When that finally was voted down in replacement of other language, or actually it was just striking it out, when that was finally struck out, after that plenary session ended, all the queer delegate caucus, or those who were queer there in presence, they all gathered by the area where the observers and viewers were. You could hear the cheer when it's passed, there was this big cheer. But then everyone gathered together and they started to sing. And everyone circled up and they kept singing. Yeah. And there was a beautiful moment of watching it that just could not help but cry.
Oh yeah,
could not.
Tears flowing.
Tears,
yeah. Almost
tears.
Ugly. You had to stop the ugly cry. It was.
and there was a person, like, we had members of our own delegation, who are LGBTQ, and hugging them and seeing their tears of joy.
Yes.
Where they felt like they finally had a place.
Yeah.
And they were finally allowed to live out their call, or they were allowed to not have to tell people maybe this isn't the church for you. Right. And then I had another friend I found later who is a pastor already, and getting to hug them and just the joy I got to feel in that moment. It lasted for that 20-minute break or whatever they gave us. It was just pure joy.
It was
that whole time, tears, ugly tears.
I'm almost tearing up now thinking about it. It was so good.
Yeah, to say you're in the room when it happens, but just to see the way that people loved in that moment will stick with me for the rest of my life.
Right.
Oh wow.
I knew what the legislation was going in. I knew what the 3 R's were. I knew what, even though they kept saying there'll be a theme that will just naturally come out. It might have been outside of those 3 R's. It wasn't. That was kind of the thought forward. Hopefully I'll always remember being able to push that yes button to clear that path. Not for myself, but just for everybody, right? I mean, just for that removal, for not only for people who couldn't get ordained, but for those who had to pretend to be something else in order to be, they had to deny a part of themselves that I believe God created. And I know somewhere in there is that argument, right? But I believe God doesn't make mistakes when he creates people. Mm-hmm. As Father Greg Boyle says, God created you exactly the way he wanted you to be, right? Mm-hmm. You're exactly what God created you to be right now. And that was a great moment. Some of that fellowship we were just talking about, I'm hoping will stick with me. As I was kind of an outsider, I hadn't been on the delegation that long. I didn't know a lot of these people know each other. The thing I learned about Methodism is you know everybody, right? All the pastors that are in Indiana know so many other pastors in Indiana. And so to be able to just kind of be a part of that was fun. But I also think I knew that legislation going in. We knew we were hopeful of it passing. Everything was showing that it should pass. But the unity with which it passed, and I don't mean that from a gloating winner's standpoint. I'm saying the fact that there was such unity and camaraderie and peace and active listening surrounding everyone there. Not everyone, but largely everyone there. That's what I think I'll take from that, is there wasn't the vitriol. And I think that I was not going to look forward to having to fight for everything, and it didn't. Now, the slow process of every single vote that takes sometimes 2 or 3 hours for one single vote was kind of to that. And Rachel, yes, I completely agree with you. We were a welcoming church before. Many of, the UMC overarchingly is a very welcoming church to begin with, and now we can officially say that we were. So.
No, that's a good comment. So the whole experience, does that give you more respect for our Congress?
No.
And
sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No.
Yes,
based off the legislation
question,
they go through, like all the stuff they
I'll
gotta
let
go
you.
through.
Do you want to start? Or you want me to start?
I really want to say yes. It
At least
does.
the process. You understand why it takes so long to get stuff through, right?
Yeah. But I don't think it has to take that. I don't think it necessarily should always have to take that long, just because it does.
Sure.
I think if people have a unified goal and people don't want to hear themselves talk too much,
That's fair.
you could push through a whole lot more. I don't know enough about this. This was my one and only time of doing it to really have an understanding of what it is large picture. I know when people have what I do see is when people have a unified front and want to get things moving forward, they can. They showed it in 2019. They showed it in 2024. When you want something, you could go for it. But what I saw in 2024 that I don't think was seen in 2019 was that it was for the good. And it was with good intentions. But yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying and I can understand that. Me in the political world at the moment.
It's probably an unfair question. I shouldn't have asked that.
If you can take your personal feelings outside, yes, it is muddled with things that you really have to spend a lot of time sifting through and understanding. And there were delegates there that had such a deep understanding of Methodist law and Methodist rule that if it was a room full of 800 me's, we would just maybe not have the same outcomes as those who really have a deep understanding, who were willing to kind of teach us and pull us along, so that the Janés of the world who already know a bunch of stuff came out, I would think, knowing even more.
I don't know that.
And in 20 years, though, you are,
Yeah.
I know a lot more coming out of it than I do going in, and I have a respect for that.
Ask me your question again. Give me your question again, Josh.
Oh, is it about,
Just repeat it.
Do you have more respect for members of Congress or in the legislative branch that go through this,
I would say I have respect for the amount of things they have to juggle.
That's fair.
But I think they could benefit for some Christian conferencing guidelines.
I like it very
So
nice.
while the Methodist Church process is based off the United States government, mostly if you think about it, to be fair, Methodism populated during the Revolutionary War. Like, Methodism really got its start in the United States and in the UK. So it makes sense why we kind of parallel that, okay? Yeah. But the difference that I'll say that the church has that maybe Congress doesn't always have, which is, first, we are about making disciples for the transformations of the world. That's our goal. I don't know that I could tell you what the goal of Congress is all the time. We have goals and we have a mission, and that mission allows us to make decisions for the betterment of that. And Christian conferencing has some really good guidelines, like about listening and about, being for other people and being proactive in the way that we be together to try to get business done, and respect and having integrity and truthfulness and transparency. There's a lot of good nuggets of wisdom that I don't know that the Congress does. I don't really know. I've never done it. I will say this: I never want to do Congress.
Okay, there we go.
This is Janée's cap. I may know a thing or two, but I don't know all the things. And I am okay not to know all the things.
Well, that's awesome. Well, hey, I appreciate both of you taking some time to come and give us some background on the General Conference, maybe address some of the topics that maybe the mainstream media sort of tried to paint in a different color. I guess if people do want to learn more, are there references they can go to, like websites they could go to, just to find out more about the General Conference and information?
There is United Methodist Communication put out a nice little multiple sheet overview. It kind of just goes over the big pieces of legislation that happened, not including the 3 R's, but more, and kind of tells you, what does that mean? Like, that resource is probably about as much as any normal person in the Methodist Church ever needs to know about this, unless you're really interested in doing like systemic changes for the church itself. But besides that, I would say the discipleship ministries, that section is where the actual conference website is held. You could go there to read all the legislation if you really love digging into your legal language. You could do that yourself if you want to. Other than that, I would say official United Methodist Communication groups, so like News, Communications, the actual website or groups are going to be your best source, just because they're going to have the actual factual information, because they're working with the actual pieces of legislation directly. Not that anybody else's opinion isn't valid and good, but typically is an opinion on what's happened.
Sure.
And like ours, we have different opinions, right? You saw where we stand on some of these issues. That is not necessarily true with everyone.
Sure.
And so I would recommend that. Just that's your best source. So whatever you get from, places like St. Andrew or the district or the Indiana Annual Conference, that'll be your best source of info.
Okay, and we can work. I think we can put a post out later today.
Yeah,
with some
once
links.
I'm done here, I'll link that the UM connection one. It's a really easy to look at, easy to digest piece of information.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
Because otherwise you're going to have to go through a long 3 or 4 PDFs to go find it, and I don't recommend that.
yeah, I think this will be
That's
good.
Yeah, we'll put a post out there. So, yeah, thanks again for watching us. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you do have any more questions, or you're watching this after it's live streamed, put them in the comments. Still, we can get back to and answer those questions. We can monitor that for until the video goes down. So, again, thank you for watching. We'll be back again next week. We'll be back at our regular scheduled time. Kelly will be back from vacation. So next Monday night will be Josh Wonders Why. And then next Thursday we'll be digging deep again. So look for those as we go to next week. So until we meet again, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the comments.
Bye.
Bye.